We routinely attribute organizational success to the internal vision of individuals. In reality, much of what we recognize as leadership is a choreographed performance, sustained by an architecture of corporate titles and compliance algorithms. This external scaffolding regulates professional behavior. The continuous gaze of public observation and strict incentive structures keep individuals in check, meaning ethical conduct is often a pragmatic adaptation to external constraints rather than a reflection of deep character. However, organizational structures are fragile. A macroeconomic shock, an internal crisis, or the attrition of human endurance can rapidly dissolve these external supports. When systemic pressure overwhelms those institutional safeguards, the illusion of practiced leadership collapses alongside them. The architecture of accountability vanishes. To navigate modern corporate ecosystems, individuals cultivate a persona. This is the meticulously curated executive mask, heavily incentivized by organizations to project an impenetrable image of unwavering confidence and competence. The psychoanalyst Carl Jung delineated the severe psychological friction this creates. Maintaining the social mask requires a continuous expenditure of energy to sequester the shadow, the repressed, unfiltered, and often contradictory aspects of the self. The psychological danger arises when an individual conflates this mask with their true identity. In a dynamic known as main character syndrome, a leader's entire sense of self-worth becomes tethered to the success of this artificial, curated image. An organizational crisis does not forge character. It merely strips away the psychological energy required to maintain the performative persona. When the individual hits rock bottom, the mask slips, and the unfiltered leader beneath is exposed. This exposure is driven by precise neurobiological mechanisms. The human brain's capacity for complex decision-making and ethical reasoning is concentrated in the prefrontal cortex, or PFC. The PFC is the newly evolved region that generates the necessary signals for top-down cognitive control. Under normal conditions, the PFC acts as the biological seat of behavioral filters. It allows leaders to inhibit impulsive reactions, delay gratification, and suppress immediate frustration when navigating complex social dilemmas. Hitting rock bottom introduces uncontrollable acute or chronic stress. This triggers subcortical structures deep within the brain to release a massive payload of catecholamines, specifically the neurochemicals norepinephrine and dopamine. This severe, uncontrollable stress response floods the neurosynapses with an overwhelming chemical surge, completely bypassing the brain's baseline regulatory systems. The excessive levels of these chemicals engage specific intracellular signaling pathways, such as feed-forward calcium CAMP. This physically opens potassium channels, disrupting connectivity within the PFC, taking it functionally offline. Simultaneously, those same stress chemicals strengthen primitive habitual responses. The amygdala and basal ganglia violently switch the brain from a reflective, analytical state into a rapid, reflexive state. This neurobiological shift explains why composed, strategic leaders can suddenly become volatile, impatient, and short-sighted when subjected to extreme pressure, decision fatigue, or sleep deprivation. Toxic leadership under extreme pressure often stems from biological inevitability rather than calculated strategy. The behavioral filters disintegrate because the neural hardware required to override selfish instincts is temporarily disabled. This neurobiological shutdown aligns with the strength model of self-regulation. Self-control, willpower, and ethical restraint are not infinite psychological traits. They operate like a finite physical muscle. Every act of self-regulation draws from a shared pool of cognitive energy. The executive leadership role drains this pool through decision fatigue and the emotional labor of surface acting, projecting calmness while experiencing internal anxiety. This cognitive exhaustion is further accelerated by a specific corporate mandate, the requirement for leaders to display constant, boundaryless empathy. Empathy, by its strict psychological definition, requires an individual to emotionally resonate with another. It is the visceral act of taking on the emotional burden of the room, blurring the boundaries between the self and the other. Continuous empathic mirroring during an organizational crisis leads directly to empathic distress fatigue. To survive the psychological pain of feeling too much, the brain forcefully shuts down its empathic receptors, leaving the leader emotionally numb. The disciplined alternative is compassion. Compassion involves recognizing the suffering of another while maintaining a firm psychological boundary. It is a proactive, cognitive state that mobilizes an action-oriented desire to help, without the risk of emotional overwhelm. When a leader reaches an advanced state of ego depletion, they experience a catastrophic failure of self-governance. Depleted leaders lack the self-control needed to suppress aggressive impulses triggered by routine demands. When the regulatory muscle fails, the leader takes the path of least psychological resistance. It requires less cognitive energy to shout at a subordinate than to patiently coach them, or to manipulate a metric, rather than execute an ethical turnaround. Standard corporate prescriptions like boundaryless empathy can accelerate this depletion. They transform a well-intentioned leader into an emotionally exhausted supervisor, operating from a position of reflexive self-preservation. If biological depletion is universal, why do only some leaders default to abusive supervision at rock bottom, while others maintain their integrity? The difference lies in a variable known as moral identity. This is a cognitive schema representing the absolute importance of morality to an individual's core self-concept, the extent to which virtues like honesty and fairness are embedded as definitions of the self. This chart predicts abusive supervision across increasing stress levels. For individuals with low moral identity, ethical behavior is mere compliance. As stress increases, abusive supervision trends upward. When cognitive resources run dry, ethical behavior ceases and abusive supervision spikes. For leaders with high moral identity, the trajectory remains flat regardless of stress. Their ethical responses are habitualized, requiring minimal cognitive effort. We observe this systematically through an OLS regression model. Examining the interaction term between stress and character, we see a coefficient of negative 0.1690 with a p-value of 0. This indicates high moral identity weakens the link between stress and abuse, functioning as a structural buffer when resources are low. This dynamic emerges in high uncertainty, resource-depleted environments where formal institutional authority vanishes. Research into common pool resource theory, pioneered by Elinor Ostrom, demonstrates that unselfish leadership is the critical variable. Leaders who voluntarily shoulder the burden of a crisis neutralize panic and significantly increase intragroup trust. This unselfishness stands in contrast to the entitled leader. Because entitled individuals operate with inflated, rigid expectations, their worldview shatters when reality fails to meet those expectations. Unable to process failure, they often adopt an authoritarian style, directing their frustration outward. Character is not an abstract philosophical virtue. It is a quantifiable safeguard that prevents organizational collapse when external scaffolding fails. Organizations cannot design completely stress-free environments. Therefore, the strategic objective is to shift the behavioral distribution of the leadership population, ensuring behavior remains stable under pressure. This heat map illustrates abusive supervision by stress and character group. The highest risk of damage lies in this red zone, high stress and low moral identity. The target state is the bottom right region, where high moral identity absorbs extreme stress without behavioral degradation. Moving an organization toward this zone requires abandoning the conditioning of performative stoicism. Forcing leaders to project absolute certainty and hide their exhaustion only drains their cognitive energy faster. Instead, leaders must lean into the reality of exposure through the strategic deployment of vulnerability. Vulnerability is a transparent, bounded admission of limitation. It is a conscious decision to admit uncertainty, rather than a chaotic emotional release. When a leader admits their own limitations, they reduce the artificial power distance that defines traditional hierarchies. This act signals that psychological safety is an operational reality, allowing teams to focus their cognitive energy on problem-solving rather than impression management. Empirical research indicates that leaders who display authentic vulnerability are 60% more likely to build deep trust, a factor that correlates with measurable gains in employee engagement, innovation, and overall performance. It is a carefully calibrated disclosure designed to build bridges. Only a leader with a profound, unshakable moral identity can afford to be transparent, because they are not terrified of what lies beneath their persona. When systems fail and biological filters collapse, the individual governed by internal discipline stands steady. They regulate their fear and exhaustion when things fall apart. Standard measures of leadership often overlook the role of internal self-governance. True leadership is defined by the quiet, unyielding integrity that remains when one is broken, exhausted, and completely unobserved.